President Xi Jinping's trip to the U.S. will be his first state visit. U.S. National Security Advisor Susan Rice called Xi's upcoming trip a milestone in deepening our cooperation and strengthening our relationship. Xi called for making sure that China-U.S. relations will enjoy sustainable and steady growth. It won't be easy. The contentious issues are not state secrets. Trade and currency, cyber attacks and espionage, South China Sea, human rights. Yet there are more issues that unite us than divide us. In preparing for Xi's visit, I've been speaking with U.S.-based China experts and China-based U.S. experts to get their take of the state of relations and their predictions for the summit. Let's get closer to China.
On May 19, 2015, a Chinese woman made her first court appearance in Los Angeles, USA. Zhao Shilan is the ex-wife of a wanted fugitive, former Chinese official Qiao Jianjun. Earlier, a grand jury indictment in U.S. District Court in Los Angeles charged Zhao and Qiao Jianjun with 3 counts of money laundering and immigration fraud. The indictment stated that the couple bought a home in the Seattle suburb of Newcastle with approximately $500,000 of laundered money gleaned from fraudulent transactions related to a huge grain storehouse in Hunan Province, China, where Qiao had served as director from 1998 to 2011. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Hong Lei said that the Qiao case was one of the 5 most important cases the two countries had agreed to work on together.
We appreciate the measures taken by the U.S. In the next step, the two sides will further strengthen cooperation. There are no safe harbors in the world for corrupted elements like Qiao Jianjun. No matter how far away he escapes, and no matter how long he remains at large, the Chinese government will definitely hunt him down and bring him back.
In a case demonstrating growing judicial cooperation between the two countries, U.S. law enforcement agents traveled to China to interview witnesses and gather evidence long before indicting the couple.
To prove a money laundering charge here, the U.S. government will have to prove that the money that came here and was used to purchase a home was the result of illegal activity, and that illegal activity took place in China. The U.S. government would have a very hard time, or U.S. law enforcement would have an almost impossible time getting that information out of China or going into China to investigate without the cooperation of Chinese law enforcement.
Judicial cooperation is just one of the areas where China and the United States work well together. Before dealing with the contentious issues, which of course we must, it is good to reflect on our common interests. China and the United States currently remain open communications and close cooperation across a wide range of areas, including the fight against terrorism, solutions to regional conflicts, prevention of the spread of weapons of mass destruction, prosecution of transnational crimes, and the prevention of epidemics. Economic ties between China and the U.S. have continued to boom over the past decades. Annual bilateral trade surpassed $500 billion in 2014. As of July 2015, it had already reached $330 billion. The two countries work together within regional and global institutions, such as the G20 and APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. Moreover, China and the U.S. have coordinated closely on the Iranian nuclear issue, DPRK nuclear issue, South Sudan conflict, and climate change.
When I first arrived in China as ambassador in 1991, it was difficult for us to send cabinet-level officials to China. And when the Secretary Baker came in November of 1991, in a sense it was a breakthrough. But it was a very difficult and contentious visit because there had to be some positive results coming out of the visit on difficult issues, or the political base in the United States for making the visit would have been undermined. And so there was some very hard bargaining during that visit. But it opened the door to some expanded engagement at the cabinet level. And it was very important. Let me relate this to the Xi Jinping visit, because everybody looks at these visits and they say, well, what will make it a success? Right. head of state to head of state, or head of government, the top leaders in countries, whether they have good relations or bad relations, are very important for two reasons. One, they offer an opportunity for productive communication.
In fact, China and the US have long established venues and diverse mechanisms for communications. These include the summit at the highest level, the annual strategic and economic dialogue at the cabinet level, exchanges between congressional bodies that started in 2004, and frequent people-to-people interactions. In June 2015, China and the US signed another framework document to establish an army-to-army dialogue mechanism between the two countries.
Ambassador Roy, President Xi Jinping is making a critical state visit to Washington at a time when most, if not all, American China experts have turned pessimistic or certainly negative in their view about China-U.S. relations in the future. First of all, why the pessimism?
There have been some recent publications talking about how the engagement strategy with China was wrong and that we ought to be moving to a quasi-containment strategy. Some China specialists have seen fissures within the ruling system in China, and the American business community feels that the investment climate in China has turned adverse. And to a degree that I haven't seen in recent decades, there's more pessimism in the American business community than I've seen before.
Which is usually one of China's primary bastions of support.
Absolutely, it has been. I don't share the pessimism. That doesn't mean I'm wildly optimistic, but my experience is that Americans tend to look at the U.S.-China relationship in much too narrow a time frame. The fact of the matter is, we are the two major powers in the Pacific region. We're going to be in interaction with each other for the indefinite future. The relationship between two big countries such as ours always involves difficult problems and enormous areas of cooperation which are invisible because if we're cooperating, the media tends not to pay much attention to it.
If we look back at the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, China, by all accounts, played a very stabilizing role, not devaluing its currency and creating a sort of race to the bottom in currency values. That was very important. So that kind of cooperation is important. Also, during the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, China played a very important role in stabilizing what you might call global aggregate demand, the economists would call it, keeping spending up for the global system.
So here is the heart of the strategic problem. Can we find a way to permit two powerful militaries to coexist in the Western Pacific without constantly treading on each other's toes?
Despite common grounds and mutual benefits of cooperation, differences remain, even grow. Since the global financial crisis in 2008 to 2009, some U.S. observers argue China is taking a more assertive approach when it comes to foreign affairs. Indeed, all is not calm in the Pacific. There are tensions over disputed sovereignty between China and Japan in the East China Sea, and between China and separately Philippines and Vietnam in the South China Sea. China argues that such disputes should not be deemed as sources of confrontation within the region.
中国在南海自己的岛礁上开展必要的建设，不是去针对谁。
China conducts necessary construction projects on its own islands in the South China Sea. This isn't targeted at any other country, but aims to improve the living conditions for troops stationed there, and to fulfill our responsibilities as the biggest country in the area.
The favorite Chinese word seems to be, at least as regarding the South China Sea, is the word meddling, which always connotes to me some children getting involved in some games they shouldn't be. But the Chinese say the U.S. is meddling in the South China Sea that disputes which they recognize are real should be left to bilateral negotiations, China and Philippines, China, Japan, China, Vietnam, whatever. But it has no, the U.S. certainly has no role to play, and even international bodies are not as significant.
I think the U.S. does not have a role to play in determining who has sovereignty over what in the South China Sea in terms of land features in the South China Sea. If China were to declare that its claim is sovereignty over land features and maritime rights that derive solely from that sovereignty over land features, I think that the U.S. would be much less concerned than it is. And then the countries can work that out.
So we have the U.S. now has a steady fleet presence in the South China Sea. When I was a young naval officer, I was trained never go in the South China Sea because it's too dangerous. There are too many shoals you can end up on. We lost a ship called the Knox, and the incident is known as Knox on the Rocks, when it went sailing into one of these islands by mistake. And there are lots of other shipwrecks in that area. But now we have ships there all the time hazarding themselves in order to make a presence to show that China is being countered.
At the core of the problem is China's modernizing rapidly, including in the military. And China's new military capabilities are beginning to erode the traditional advantage in air and naval power that the United States has had in the Western Pacific. Conceivably, China's growing military capabilities could reach the point that it would cause our allies to lose confidence in the ability of the United States to support them in a crisis. If so, then a fundamental American interest is being infringed on. But if we try to maintain the traditional superiority in air and naval power that we have in the Western Pacific, then China will not be able to defend its own territory. Because in the past, China's wars were either fought inside of China or on China's borders. And China now wants to push that defense perimeter out further. So here is the heart of the strategic problem. Can we find a way to permit two powerful militaries to coexist in the Western Pacific without constantly treading on each other's toes? In my judgment, that's exactly what our top leaders should be focused on. In my judgment, they've intellectually sort of looked at the problem, but they haven't been willing to address it yet in any serious way.
America's pivot to Asia-Pacific has confirmed to many Chinese their suspicion that U.S. policy is to contain China and has emboldened China's adversaries in the region to escalate tensions. The China-proposed Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, currently counting 57 founding members, is planned to be operational by the end of 2015. At first, the U.S. lobbied its allies not to join, but the pressure collapsed when Germany, Britain, and other U.S. allies announced their memberships and financial contributions.
And I think there is in some quarters sometimes a kind of reflexive action. Wherever China's on an issue, we've got to think of why we might be somewhere else. A good example of that, in my view, is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. In fact, 57 countries, most of which are our friends and allies, actually agreed to participate as charter members of the bank. Our initial reflex was really to think this was not in our interests, and we tried to persuade at least some of our friends to the wisdom of our point of view, which was not successful. I think we should have looked at this as the world needs infrastructure, Asia needs infrastructure, we need financing for it, and anybody who wants to contribute to that, more power to them.
While some experts compare Xi's state visit in 2015 to Deng Xiaoping's in 1979, most say that Xi's visit is the more challenging. At the top of the list is cybersecurity, with charges and countercharges escalating for months. U.S. spy chief James Clapper referred to China as one of the most active sources of espionage, targeting a broad spectrum of U.S. interests. But then, on both sides, perhaps some signs of tempering. To ease tensions just days before his state visit, Xi sent his special envoy Meng Jianzhu, Politburo member and head of public security, to the U.S. Meng met with U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, Secretary of Homeland Security Jed Johnson, and U.S. National Security Advisor Susan Rice. Both sides reached important consensus on combating cyber crimes. frank exchanges seem to produce progress in combating cyber crimes.
Cybersecurity, accusations of cyber attacks, has become one of the most contentious issues between the U.S. and China. China, of course, points to the revelations of Snowden and the spy planes that frequently travel near Chinese territorial waters and near the mainland. The U.S., of course, has accused China of launching very significant cyber attacks against the U.S. government and against many American corporations. How, from your perspective, from the Chinese perspective, put the whole issue of mutual cyber attacks into context?
就是这个网络的问题呢，我认为中国、美国都是共同受害者，包括现在美国这个窃取的一些一些盟友啊，这个英国、法国他们领导人，应该说大家都是网络的共同受害者。现在应该什么？应该制定一个网络规则啊，就像当年为什么我一开始说咱们讨论的这个核安全的问题讨论的比较多，当时就认为核对我们大家构成了威胁，所以当时制定了很多这个限制核武器啊、限制核发展的这些规则。那么现在是不是网络也要制定一些规则？
It's not just a government-to-government problem, but it's becoming a society-to-society problem. Of course, Snowden, when he revealed what he revealed, I think concerned many Chinese people beyond the government there. So this conflict, you might say, between our two governments is seeping into the larger attitudes there.
It's also an issue that's very hard to coordinate within a government. Yeah. And somewhat the irony of this is, unlike most issues, the higher you get up in each government, generally the more you're dealing with decision makers who themselves don't understand the issue. I think that you cannot argue to the other side that that is not my intention and have the other side believe it.
Full Frame, a talk show with a difference. We go in depth with celebrities to explore their charitable causes, revealing trends in culture and the arts and bringing you real human stories. Exposing you to people who are making a difference on a global scale. Full Frame, a weekly show from Los Angeles.
The best way to address serious problems is to really understand them. So let's take the problems first. Could you lay out the specific differences in specific, and if you can, in order of importance in terms of the emotionality of the moment, so that we have on the table the totality of the differences?
As a matter of fact, the first and foremost should be the trust deficit. Both China and the United States, we have these problems. And from China's perspective, China is pretty much sensitive to Americans' military deployment around Asia Pacific, and also its efforts in strengthening its allies in the region. And so there is a lot of kind of debate also in China how to view this, how to look at this issue. Of course, from American perspective, they are very much concerned about the possible challenge posed by China to its supremacy, its leadership in the region and in the world at large. So I think this kind of distrust between them, it needs to be addressed.
The general narrative in China is that the U.S. policy overall is to contain China's rise, and the general narrative in the U.S. is that China has some sort of an aggressive or expansionist intent in their rise. How do you deal with these overarching narratives that are propounded by media in both countries?
I think that you cannot argue to the other side that that is not my intention and have the other side believe you. Both of us have said to each other for years, on the Chinese side, our rise is peaceful. We do not seek to displace the U.S. from Asia, et cetera, et cetera. And on the U.S. side, we have said that we engage with China to facilitate or welcome China's successful development and seek to cooperate with China, et cetera, et cetera. And neither side fully believes the other. The problem with a conspiracy theory is that you can never disprove a conspiracy theory. Well, I have pointed out things to these interlocutors in various occasions where, what the U.S. has done is clearly, in America's eyes at least, been helpful to China, where we've made choices to be helpful to China. The response just shows how clever you are, right? And that's what conspiracy theories are like.
They're always self-consistent in their own thinking.
I think it's that kind of mutual suspicion about long-term intentions that is frankly very, very hard to construct a logical argument, a speech, an occasion that really dispels that. So I think the way you get at that, insofar as you can, is through concrete cooperative efforts.
As you see China's diplomatic moves over the last few years, we see a much more engaged China, aggressive China in the totality of the diplomacy of the world. China is now the primary funder of infrastructure in many countries in the world, in Africa, even Latin America, now Central Asia. What is the implication long-term of this significant engagement that China has with the world, and what does that say about President Xi's foreign policy?
You use the term aggressive. I wouldn't use the term aggressive. I don't see the Chinese as following an aggressive foreign policy. I don't see the Chinese fighting a war like the United States fought in Iraq. I don't see it as consistent either with the policy, the history, the tradition, China's inward focus. So I don't see it. I see that the developments externally have been mostly positive. I mean, look at their work on Iran and on reaching this agreement with Iran. It has been very positive. You ask Secretary Kerry, has China helped reach this agreement? He would say absolutely, that Wang Yi has been very productive in supporting the efforts to reach an agreement with Iran. I mentioned Syria earlier, the AIIB, the infrastructure investments they're making in places are generally positive. China XM funds projects. Are they benefiting China? Absolutely. Are Chinese construction companies doing it? Yes. But is it aggressive? I wouldn't say it's aggressive. It's putting China in the place where its economy has placed it.
In fact, throughout the history of Sino-US relations, differences have always existed. Thus, managing differences has always been a main task for leaders on both sides. And that's why mechanisms such as the strategic and economic dialogue exist. But experts believe, first and foremost, China and the US should enhance mutual trust, and a summit like this is a good start.
The U.S. has had sort of this ideological, moral commitment to enforce stability. China has had less of that, but actually has more necessity from its own economic condition to see that happening. So it's a natural marriage, not to use force, but to use the strength of two great powers in all of these different countries.
So I would hope our two presidents can give voice to that in a very tangible way, because as two big powers, we have common interests and we have divergent interests, and that's That's in the nature of the universe. But what we need to do is always make sure that the balance in our relationship is a positive balance represented by cooperation, so that we have some political capital in both societies to weather the strains that inevitably will be there. The search for the perfectly congenial relationship is probably a worthy goal, but unrealistic.
I think no single concession will change the relationship in a broad sense. Again, there's an underlying concern about long-term intentions and different ways of connecting the dots to understand, where things are really headed. So I think it's a difficult issue. Having said that, I think there are areas where we can do a lot. One of those is in the bilateral investment treaty. Investment is different from trade. Real investment on the ground, new businesses and that kind of thing is different from portfolio investment or buying debt or that kind of thing.
The climate change issue is still out there, and there's room for further progress. So what I don't know is whether the two sides have been working to see whether further progress is possible. In the mill-to-mill area, certainly the confidence-building measures are a beginning, not an end, of what we can do in that area. So it would be helpful if we could see additional. But I think the aspect that would make the visit most useful will not necessarily be totally visible to the outside. And that would be to have constructive discussions on how to deal with cyber issues and how to contain frictions in the South China Sea. In other words, how to bring some of the issues that have been casting a dark shadow over the relationship into a brighter perspective. Because that's essentially what the leaders on both sides want to do. And that's how I would look at it.
The general perception in the U.S. is that China has become aggressive internationally. The general perception in China is that the U.S. seeks to contain China and prevent its natural rise. Conflicting views are exacerbated by the political season blooming in the U.S. and a nationalistic media booming in China. How to assess the summit? The communiqué is key. The more specific, the better. To state issues openly is better than to pretend they don't exist. Will both presidents use the same terms in the same ways, such as new type of big power relations? Certainly there are common interests, economic stability and growth at the top of the list. Also, stopping regional wars, terrorism, climate change, among others. Certainly there are mechanisms to promote China-U.S. relations, including high-level visits, military exchanges, the strategic and economic dialogue, people-to-people contacts. Next week, at the summit in Washington, we'll find out. Let's see who comes closer.